Right. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming and attending. Yeah, I got talking to Carl about this a while ago, informally, and we've sort of formalised it a bit more recently. It's a bit daunting sort of trying to pack in this amount of information into a short period of time, but hopefully we'll cover everything, so I'll get on with it. The one thing I would like to mention at the start is that none of the images belong to me. I don't take pictures or photographs very often when I do the rawful. So they will all be copyright, so please don't use the pictures without permission. I'll try and highlight when we've got region examples of them, where local people have contributed to this and help with this presentation. So this is the basic information about all the Culeate Hymenoptera, including the wasps and the ants. A couple of pairs of wings, the forewing being larger and the hindwing smaller. And the main differences being that bees are obviously associated with plants and pollen to feed their young rather than prey or scavenge material. It's why they're particularly plant associated. All bees, as we know, forage and gather pollen, usually in the dry state and usually in specific areas of the body, but sometimes more diffusely. There's an exception that we'll come on to later on. Go to the next slide, please, Carl.
I think it's catching bad. It's not. It's not working for me.
Right. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, and if you keep pressing enter, you'll only have to do this on this slide. The other slides should just the text will roll down. So yeah, we've got a total, total around 270 species of bees recorded in the UK. That includes the solitary bees and all the other bees, and it includes both the ones that we have in our present state at the present time, extinct bees, and those that have arrived more recently. So it's the vast majority of bees that we're talking about, only a few bumblebees and even fewer of those in our area, and quite a wide range, which we'll come to subsequently. And a range of nesting habitats that we'll also see as we go through the different families. Okay, next slide, please, Carl. So in a UK context, we're talking about any of the bees other than what are sometimes called the corbiculate bees, honeybee and the bumblebees, which have the modified hind leg that collects the pollen. There's a much greater range than there are with the other social bees in size. Very, very small, like the small lazier glosson bee in the top right, which is 4.5 millimeters, to more or less an upper limit around 12 millimeters, which sometimes, like the Amphidium in the bottom right corner, we'll get to. And wide range of life cycles and ecology. Some are single brooded, univoltine, some have 2 generations a year, some probably even more than that in a year with very good weather. Some are ground nesting and some are aerial nesting. Next slide, please. So the vast majority of all the solitary bees are polyelectic. So they'll forage pollen and utilise the pollen for the larvae from a wide range of plant families. Andrena bicolour, top right is a good example of that. Some species are much more restricted. the range, again, how restricted they might be. And so they're targeting closely related plants from either the same family or even the same genus sometimes. A good example, a good regional example, thanks to Alan Holmes for the bottom right picture, is tormental mining bee, and a much wider range of bees that are completely reliant on willow pollen, spring flying species. We don't have any monolectic species in Lancashire, or indeed in the northwest. We have 3, I think, in the UK, in the south. Some of the solitary bee genera are entirely parasitic, and the hosts of those parasitic bees may be related to them within the same family or not, but usually they share the same hosts. So yeah, the different families of bees, we've got Andrenidae, which Andrena, ground nesting bees, wide range of sizes. Apidae, very wide ranging family there, which you've got very different ecologies and life cycles. Colettidae, which are the more primitive bees, which we'll explain later. Halictidae, which include some very similar bees. They do exhibit eusociality, which is a bit different from one parasitic genera. Milletidae, which are quite indistinctive, quite limited in our region. And Megacarlyii, which include some of the more familiar solitary bees. Next slide, please, Carl. So yeah, the Andrenidae, we only have Andrena, not Panurgus, in our region. Ground nesting bees, they all carry pollen on the back legs and the proboscideum, on the rear of the thorax. We've got a large number in Lancashire, and they're all of these are likely to, if not found in Cumbria as well. We've got a range here, Andrena clarkella top left, Andrena fulva or tawny mining bee after that to the right, ashy mining bee to the right of that, one of the mini mining bees, minitula group, which you'll mention, Andrena humilis, the bottom left, Andrena chrysosceles, which is a banded type, Andrena nigriceps, a scarcer species, and Andrena barbellabris, bottom right, which is a coastal species. Next slide, please. So yeah, nesting, invariably, or the vast majority of the time, they are ground nesting. You can see that aggregation on the right of Andrena vega, species we don't get, or singly in one conspicuous tumuli, the excavated spoil top left. Some will nest in cavities. Many thanks to my Greater Manchester colleague, comrade Karen McCartney, for that picture bottom left of Andrena scotica. They quite often end up in houses. They're like concealed entrances, but generally speaking, a ground nesting lot. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is one of the spring flyers, Andrena clarkella, reliant on willow pollen. Quite distinctive when very fresh, very orange hind tibia and brush at the back, very black abdomen, and then the same colour as the leg on the thorax. So that's clarkella, quite a robust bee, and also quite a robust species. One of the few of the common name, tawny mining bee, not reliant on willow at all, but much more polyelectic. It'll choose from a range of plants. Next slide, please. Ashy mining bee, very distinctive, especially when it's fresh and it's clean. It's got that sort of double band that almost resembles some of the bumblebees on the thorax, with the black band between the wing bases. Again, it's polyelectic, slides a little bit later. Small Andrena minitula group, these are very, very hard to tell apart, so we can't really say much about them. Next slide, please. Another polyelectic species, Andrena bicolor. It's yeah, widely polyelectic. Next slide, please. This is one we've already mentioned, tormental mining bee. It's subject to a species action plan, so that's a northwest speciality. Next slide, please. This one, thanks to John Wright for this picture from Darwin area. Very northern bee, Andrena ruficus, finds very early. It's essentially, most records are in Scotland and it doesn't come any further south than Lancashire, so very much a northern species. Next slide, please. Epidemio, a very big family, very different to the Andrenas, and a wide range of genera involved. Amphiphora top left, Ceratina top middle, the very wasp-like Epiolus top right, Eucera with a very long antenna bottom left, Milleted, one of the parasitic genera bottom middle, and Nomada, another parasitic genus bottom right. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is one that's worth showing. The woundwort mining bee, sometimes called Amphiphora facata, especially seen on woundworts. Got a very distinctive orange tip to the tail. It's very small but quite distinct, and yeah, will often be found later on in the year on Stachys. Next slide, please. The parasitic genera Epiolus, they're very reminiscent of Oxybellus wasps, which are aculeate wasps and often found in the same sandy habitat. These are parasites of a completely unrelated bees, the Colettis. Next slide, please. You see that we don't get these in the northwest, unfortunately. Very distinctive, long antennaed bee, but I think should you find them, they'd be readily identifiable. Next slide, please. Milleted, again, as far as I know, we don't have any records yet for Lancashire or Cumbria, possibly crept into Cheshire, South Cheshire at least. But we do get the host in Lancashire and Cumbria now on Phophora plumbipes. Next slide, please. And yeah, the Nomada group, this is a bit more recognisable, one of the more black and yellow ones. They're usually parasitic on one or more hosts of vandrina. It varies between species, how host specific they are, but they can be distinctive, and they can be, like all bees, females are much more distinctive than males, you know, in the vast majority anyway of cases. Next slide, please. Yeah, not a northwest resident, but worth putting in as a curiosity. Anybody who's been to Mediterranean countries on holiday or anywhere further afield might have seen Zyla culpa. They're very large, bigger than the vast majority of our bumblebees, and they are occasionally imported in wood. They may have bred successfully on occasion. This picture is actually from Preston. Most likely this bee just came in on timber from nearby Preston docks. Next slide, please. Yeah, moving on to a much smaller family, Colettidae. These are quite primitive bees. Colettis, the ground nesting bees, it's resembled to an extent some Andrena. Hylaeus to the right, very, very different. Comparatively hairless bees, almost a bit wasp-like again, really, especially if you see them in flight, and they nest aerially in either bramble stems, sometimes bee ortels, deadwood, and other cavities. So the Colettis genus, we don't have many, sometimes called plasterer bees, because these anhylaeus, they can coat the inside of the nest of the cells and do with a cellophane-like substance that protects the cell from fungal infection or moisture. Colettis canicularis, top left, that's a spring flying species reliant on willow. It's a big non-banded one. We've got Colettis phodians, top right, which is a mostly coastal species. Colettis floralis, bottom right, which is essentially a Scottish and Irish species, which is one of the rarest species in England. Only a couple of records in there for Cumbria, no records for Lancashire. And then the ivy bee, Colettis hederi, bottom left, which is the only autumn bee that we have. And that's more or less always found on ivy, and that's crept into Lancashire and Cumbria in recent years. Next slide, please. So Harlequins, yeah, as I say, related to same family, but very, very different looking. The identification of the males is sometimes easier. The top left is a male Harlequins communis, sometimes called the yellow-faced bees. In communis, you see the yellow marks near the antenna, they curve around the base of the antenna, and that's very distinctive in the idea of that species. Pollinators, top right, that has quite long hair on the face, which is quite a good diagnostic character amongst the genus. Brevicornis, bottom right, that's a really, really small one with very reduced yellow markings on the face, quite distinctive. And the Confusus, which has a very, very similar species in the south that we don't get, again, has some distinctive facial markings in comparison to the others. Next slide, please. Moving on to Halictidae. The Halictidae, they're generally small to medium-sized ground nesting bees. They are a little bit different to the other solitary bees in that they can, at least in Lazy glosson and Halictids, they can exhibit some eusociality. So they approach the behaviour of the social bees in having a bigger female that starts off the nest and some workers or proto-workers, if you like, later on. Halictus are on the left, that's Halictus rubicundus, Lazy glosson top picture in the top right, and the Sphecodes, which is the parasitic genera, the bottom. I've not highlighted any Dufuria, can't pronounce that one. We don't get that in the area. Next slide, please. So yeah, the left Halictus rubicundus, one of the bigger and more distinctive halictid bees that we get. One of the good characters for telling the halictine bees, certainly Halictus glossum, is this marking at the end of the abdomen, which is actually a gap of hairs at the bottom called a rema. Don't think you can see it on Halictus humalorum to the right very easily because of the pollen. But yeah, that's something that is distinctive. And sometimes called, I think, in common names, end banded, because these bands on the abdomen, on the tergites, are at the end of the abdominal sections rather than on the base, which we'll see is useful distinction from Lazy glossum. Next slide, please, Cal. So yeah, Lazy glossum with the calceatum as an example. So the main difference from the previous genus is that the bands, if they're visible, and this can be very, very tricky, are at the base. So on the female there and on the male there, there's sometimes cold-base banded bees in common, much more modern common language. But the sexes can be quite dimorphic. The male on the right is not always red on the abdomen, but frequently is. So it looks quite a different insect. You wouldn't associate the two together very easily. Next slide, please. This comes from the group of what we would call the Brassy small Lazy glossums. We only have 4 species in the UK. They're all recorded for the Northwest. I think all 4 for Cumbria, certainly all 4 for Lancashire. Lazy glossum leucopus is one of the few that's got a distinctive character in these white tarsi that you can see the last segments on the leg, but that's about as good as it gets. These are very difficult to identify from each other. Next slide, please. Yes, Sphecodes, much of a muchness, unfortunately, in terms of identification, and very, very difficult to sort from each other, even as specimens, never mind in the field. We have some distinctive species. Sphecodes gibbous, shown on the left. I think that's another one of Alan's pictures, so thanks to Alan. very large, very dark wings, very similar to another species that we don't get, which we get in future. We wouldn't be able to diagnose that species in the field. Then in Sphicodes monilicornis on the right, that's quite distinctive because it's got a very box-shaped head, which is quite unique amongst that genera in the UK. So that is if you've got the right angle, and you do need the right angle, that in itself being a tricky thing, that can be one that can just about be identified in the field. Next slide, please. Yeah, the Milletidae are really a small family. Not only not many species nationally either, but even more restricted so in our region. So we don't get many. They have no small genera or species in. They're all sort of medium to a larger size, and unhelpfully are quite indistinctive, really, with the exception of Dasypoda, of which is only one UK species on the left, which has these, I think they're sometimes called pantaloon bees, due to this extraordinary densely haired scopa for collecting pollen on the back legs. If you look on the Bee Wars maps, curiously, there's no records for the area. In the older literature pre-1900, it was said to be recorded in Wallasey, so it would have Cheshire records, but it's strange because if it did, it's long been extinct, but it's hard to think what it could have been confused with in terms of any other British bee. So that's an oddity. Whether recolonise in future is something we'll have to wait, but that will be good. Macropis in the middle, quite an unusual bee in that it's basically associated with the yellow loosestrife in this country, or I think it will use a cultivated dotted loosestrife as well, but it uses floral oils from the plant, which is quite unique within our bee fauna. And then Milleted, which we do have at least one of, in this case, Milleted hemorrhoidalis. So we do have one representative. Previously, I think we possibly have more. Next slide, please. So yeah, Milleted hemorrhoidalis, a distinctive species associated with harebells, and quite a nice story in the Cumbria context, in that the first records for the Northwest from Grange over Sands in the 1940s came here from Holm Island, which is illustrated. And then there was an entire gap of records, quite possibly just not looked for, or at the right time, just not picked up for whatever reason, and it was found at the same spot. But subsequently, post-1996, the records have been much more widespread. Holm Wrangle, if I've said that right, much further to the north, and then near to Barrow, Congal, I think. But it'll use any bellflower. Quite often in our region, we'd be looking at harebell, and that's where we'd expect to hope to find it. But it will use other campanulas, other bellflowers as well. So it's worth always checking out any harebell for this species, which is certainly very, very localized still. Next slide, please. So yeah, the Megacarlyii, a really big subfamily, and this contains some of the much more, probably more familiar, particularly the garden setting bees that you might have seen. They range from this Amphidium, top left, Monoptrichilostoma, Celioxis, which is parasitic with the sharp tail here. Heriades, one of the resin bees, so-called, which we don't get in our area. Opletis, this is Opletis claviventris, which is recorded for our area, Lancashire and Cumbria. Megacarlyii, or the leafcutter bees here. The mason bees, Osmia, and Stellis, which is the parasitic genera, bottom right. Next slide, please. Yeah, Amphidium monocartem, very distinctive member of this family. It gets a common name of woolcardy. It could be a bit confusing because we've got the bumblebees as well. But it gets that name from what they call nitidification, I think is the full name for it. But essentially, carding or wool carding, as the common name would suggest. It uses things like lamb's ear, stachys, in the top left and shaves the hairs off, and then uses those hairs to line the inside of the nest cell. It's quite a unique bit of behaviour on its part. Bottom left, that's a very deliberately blurred picture just to show how you're more likely to see it whizzing around your garden. They seem particularly fond of toadflax and other labiates for pollen and nectar, probably both. Next slide, please. Helostoma, yeah, they're certainly, we only have one species in the northwest, and that's on the left, Helostoma florisomni, which is associated with buttercups unusually for pollen. These are aerial nesting species, usually in dead wood, quite slim in contrast to the other Megacarlyids, though, with big jaws for excavating the dead wood when they're making the nests. So yeah, very distinctive. Next slide, please. Celioxis, one of the parasitic genera, with that very sharp tail, sometimes called sharp tail bees, associated essentially with leafcutter bees, such as in this case Megacarlyii, and the coastal circumcinctor. Circumcinctor is a ground nester, which is worth mentioning. So this would be seen both inland and at the coast in that situation. Next slide, please. Hargreaves, to get the name Resinb, they seal the nest when it's been constructed, in this case in a provision sort of so-called bee hotel, with resin, quite often pine resin, but not always pine resin. It's been found in areas where pine resin shouldn't really be available. It's not found in our area yet, but it is spreading north very rapidly. I think there's a record in the West Midlands, so it's worth keeping an eye out for this one. Hopefully it might be something we see in future. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the male. We saw the female on the general slide of the family, but yeah, the male has a much different look. Big translucent, I should say opaque, green eyes. They're sort of a slim Megacarlyid. They nest in deadwood and bramble stems, often in bramble, but they're not particularly distinct, can be confused with Osmia mason bees. Next slide, please. Yeah, the Megacarlyii leafcutter bees. These are going to be something that's, I hope people are more familiar with if they get them in the gardens. They're known for their habit, obviously get the name like the bee on the left, of cutting these very neat sections of leaf out, which they create the nest cells with. Ends up looking sort of somewhat like a cigar when they're fully constructed and dried out. The one on the right is definitely Megacarlyii. It's a difficult genus to tell apart, particularly in the larger species, with some critical features, very discreet, which focus on the very end of the abdomen, which are very difficult in the field. The one on the left probably is as well, but that's not a very good angle to see. But I do believe that picture was taken in Maudsley, and I think that was the only leafcutter bee that we recorded in that area at the time. Next slide, please. Yeah, the Osmia mason bees, Osmia bicornis, or the red mason bee, top left and top bottom. The bicornis means two horns, so they've got these projections, two projections that come out from the face, and they use that to help in the nesting process to manipulate that mud and they're often seen in bee hotels. These more faded examples, bottom left. But in the other mason bees, the other osmia, you do get different nesting behaviour and ecology. Polyelectic, which is probably mostly coastal in Lancashire and Cumbria. They excavate into the snail shell. They use it as a de facto structure, and their cells are constructed within in that, using that as a chamber. So quite different. Next slide, please. Now the parasite Stelis with Celioxis, the sharp tail, some of the few parasites within. The smaller Stelis I have mentioned just because they're so infrequently seen. The largest Stelis is not common either by any means. It's top left. Punctulatissima gets on name because it's sort of very, very strong punctures on the body. The definite host of this bee is the woolcarder bee, the Amphidium monocartem that we've mentioned before, top right. But it's just a possibility that osmia or mason bees, these bees shown on the bottom, are also involved, but they're not proven as hosts. They haven't been reared from the nests of the hosts, so we can't be certain on that. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is one where you'll have to press enter on all to get all the text on. Sorry, one back. Yeah, that's the one. We've had, obviously, like everywhere, some decline. Nationally, we've had the extinction of one mason bee and one solitary bee. To my knowledge, in the area, we've got 2 bees for certain that have got, well, 1 bee for certain, 2 almost certain. The bottom right, Osmia xanthomilana, is one of the UK's rarest bees now, and it's restricted to a couple of sites in the UK, one in North Wales and one, if it's still there, in Hampshire. Andrena varians, top right, looks somewhat similar to Andrena laponica, which is, I think, bilberry mining bee is a common name, so much more likely to be found, but flying slightly later in the year is the other species. This species is associated with rosaceous shrubs like blackthorn and fruit trees, so a bit of a difference. And we've had these rapid changes in distribution. A marked and recent example of that being Colettis hederi, the ivy associated bee, which has spread like wildfire, as have some other bees and wasps more recently. So yeah, there's been definitely a substantial change, not all one way, and in fact change in our area is probably been minor compared to other areas. That's not to say that abundance of everything has not declined greatly. And next slide, please. Yeah, so the key references I just wanted to put in towards the end. These are literature references. Michael Archer's book for Yorkshire, you might be able to get second-hand copies online. Carl Clee's and Tony Parker's Atlas for Cheshire is available online if you follow that link at LRC, Cheshire's Record Centre. Then there's the Handbook of British Bees, very expensive volume, but very, very comprehensive and superb. And Steve Falk's great works. If you want local resources, we're really, you can, again, with Gardener's Book, you can pick up second-hand copies of that, sometimes online for Lancashire and Cheshire. Unfortunately, the most relevant Cumbrian reference is not available online, but if anybody wants a copy of that, feel free to drop me an email. I think Carl will drop me email into the chat, and I'll send that over to them as a copy. You should be able to get rootledge, which is a bit earlier, just a bit, 1933, because I think all the transactions of the Carlisle Naturalist History Society are now available online. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of key online resources, which really will help with any identification and anything really about the distribution biology, ecology, behaviour, anything like that. Bee Wars is our UK charity, not only covering Britain but the Channel Islands and Ireland. See folks Flickr site, if you follow that link to Apoidea, he's got a fantastic array of vast majority, if not all, of the British recorded species. And then, yeah, there's great strength in the Facebook sites. I don't use Twitter myself, but I'm sure that can be very helpful for ID when needed. I know there's a lot of people contribute towards that. And I can't think of anything more useful. I think those are the key resources, really. Literature resources are very good and very interesting, but certainly for identification purposes, you can't beat what's online. And that's the end of the show. Which I'm sorry I failed to bring up. So sorry if that was a bit of a rush. Sorry about that, Carl. Rushed through.
That's okay, Ben. Yes, yeah, from the vast diversity that there is out there, one of the things that I think for certainly the Cumbria recorders for really some of those ones that you identified as being particularly potentially out in Cumbria that were just under recorded. What would you say that the top ones that we could be seeing that we're just not recording?
In terms of really regionally distinctive species.
Yeah.
The top of the list has to be Colettis floral. Done it again. Floralis. Just read it. Don't pronounce it. Who knows how you pronounce these things anyway. But yeah, it's very much a coastal species, so that's where to look for it. It's got those very white coloured bands, and it's going to be very similar to Colettis succinctus. But I think I got excited about one post that was put on one of the Facebook sites. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to tell from Colettis succinctus, but it's a lot smaller. But that will be the difficult one, unfortunately, to look out for. Andrena laponica is probably under-recorded in Cumbria, associated with bilberry, so should be about. A big distinctive Andrena, which it's got a very, sort of looks like Andrena clarkella, but with some rusty red hairs at the top of the abdomen and very black hairs on the hind legs. But that's one to look for in bilberry. Tormental mining bee, I'm sure there are more areas than there are recorded for Cumbria. You just need tormental and some suitable nesting substrate for that, really. The cuckoo bee associated with Andrena tassata is Nomada robertiotiana, if that's how you pronounce it, Lord knows. There is one record for Cumbria. I think Neil Robinson did record that in the 90s. The only Lancashire records are 3 from 1980. I've found a few sites for Andrena tarsata, never found the cuckoo, and it is quite a distinctive cuckoo species that if you get a good photograph of it, should be separable from the others. It's very, very small. That doesn't help, but with the abilities I'm sure a lot of the audience have in taking pictures, that will be one to look out for.
Well, I think if anybody has got questions, if you'd like to unmute yourself and click off the video so we can see you, and just shout up any questions if you've got anything for Ben. Well, I've popped your email address, Ben, in the chat. So that's there for people to follow up if they want to have direct links with you. The Robinson thing, just briefly tell us a little bit about the Neil Robinson account that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's such a shame really that this is not more widely accessible to any of you that do record in Cumbria, because it was, I mean, Neil was active both in Lancashire and he worked in Lancashire. He was resident in Cumbria, and he did so much work from the 80s through the 90s and into the early 2000s, recording, particularly regionally, and he made earlier records as well. And he compiled all that into what was effectively an atlas, really, but done in a very succinct style, but it's still very, very useful. So yeah, if I can get that out to people more, which I'm sure is what Neil would have wanted at some point, because it wasn't a formal publication, it was just in a BWAR's newsletter, then and people can make use of that, and hopefully that will contribute to further recording efforts.
We've had a question come in, Ben, and it's why do you think Anthrophora plumipes has returned in such large numbers, and also the Colettis hederae?
Well, in terms of Colettis hederae, that was never a. I don't know whether we've got something bleeping on the. Is somebody unmuted and pressing something? I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah, Colettis hederae. It's a recently discovered species. I mean, it was only discovered new to science quite recently, and it's spread through the UK over the last decade. Sally, when you're unmuted, that's why I'm tapping you screen. Yeah, so that's the reason for Colettis hederae. For Anthrophora plumipes, very odd. Like I say, if you read through Neil's atlas work, you'll see that there is an old record for Cumbria, which I think he discounted just because it was based on one record and possibly one specimen. But it's such a distinct. I think he possibly thought there was a mix-up with the data label, so maybe it had come from another part of the country. So maybe that's why, and understandably, with there only being one record. But from what I've read, accounts of Lancashire, Anthrophora plumipes definitely was widespread and in some places abundant pre-1900. In Lancashire, I know for a fact that there were no records between 1900 and 2010, I think, or a bit before that. So yeah, a bit of a mystery on that one. I mean, obviously, it would be very surprising if climate wasn't a strong driver in a lot of these scenarios, but there must be other factors involved as well. Obviously, species are very different, will react to different sort of stimuli and different changes with varying degrees, and sort of they react in different ways as well, so they won't sort of all flood north. Some may become more niche, some may move to more specialised habitat, some may adapt and become more generalised. So it's a good question, but yeah, Anthrophora plumipes, an odd one, could even be nesting habitat. maybe it's been had a complete lack of nesting habitat. A good place for Anthophora flamipes, if you're in Cumbria, I believe Carlisle is one hotspot for it. But if you have lungwort planted in your garden, that's a very good plant to bring it in. It will use comfrey, it'll use other things. So yeah, those plants in particular are useful.
I just interject one moment.
Yeah.
You mentioned Carlisle's a good place for Anthophora plumipees. Actually, you can be more specific than that. Tully House Gardens, for example. The new Tully House Museum Garden, it's got a flowering currant in it, which they seem to like, as well as some lungwort and various other sort of similar flowers to that. So, but I've seen it sort of in places like Bitts Park and in the shrubs and that sort of stuff there. So it's for some reason or other, Carlisle is a sort of a hotspot for it. Perhaps they had a rail card.
Yeah, maybe some urban heat effects, or just more observers. It is a curious one, but we do seem to get species that jump into the Morecambe Bay area. A good example, it applies more to wasps than bees, strictly speaking, but there are a lot of species only recorded for Morecambe Bay in Lancashire, and there's no records otherwise.
Oh, right.
Could be a microclimate factor as well at play in that case, and obviously Morecambe Bay is particularly unique in our regional context. But yeah, there are some species, North Wales, and then we don't get anything until a bit of a gap suggests that they're not bothering with lynx.
Oh, cheers, Ben. Thank you.
Okay.
A couple of general questions have come in. Liz is asking us, you mentioned very briefly in your talk about the plaster and the mason bees. Could you just refresh us on what they're doing, why they've got those names? Yeah,
with mason bees, quite simply, and it's not a very useful common name, because red mason bee obviously would be the one that would normally have nested in the loose mortar between bricks. So that's where the mason bees would have got the name originally. But of course, there's osmia that, like the one I mentioned, that nest in snail shells, others nest in bramble stems. So it's sort of like, if you like, a reductive common name that's come from quite a common and widespread representative of the genus. Plaster bees is a bit more useful in terms of a reference and a description, because both Colettis and Hylaeus, they sort of apply this cellophane-like material from saliva secretion to the inside of the nest, and that acts as protection against humidity and against fungal infection. With Colettis, you can understand that they quite often, particularly Colettis canicularis, nests at the coast, so it's quite damp. There could be wave action, there could be flooding. In fact, one of the Colettis, Halophilus, which is possibly creeping into our region, the nests have actually been observed to be submerged. So that's quite, I mean, this has literally been seen, must be a literal case of the tides come in, cover the nests, tides gone back out, bees have come out. So yeah, it's that's a good description of biology. And the osmia one, it's a nice name, but it doesn't really mean anything.
We've got a sort of habitat question, which is sort of slightly related to what you've just said, and that's about, Sally's asking you, are there any specific things that we could be doing with coastal areas of Cumbria to improve habitats for bees generally, I guess, but particularly, I suppose, more widely for pollinators, I guess?
Yeah, possibly one of the biggest problems, I guess, in the coastal area. We can't do anything about coastal squeeze and things like that, but when dune systems become very fixed, they lose a lot of value for aculeates. Both bees and wasps, they really go down. So keeping the open sand habitat, being very dynamic in the way that the dunes are managed is important. I'm not saying that having some fixed areas is not important, and obviously those areas are going to support very important vegetation complexes, which are vital for the bees as well. But in terms of nesting habitat, you know, dune systems are by their very nature dynamic. So having areas of bare open sand is something that you would expect whether people were here or not. With the tide left to do what it wanted to do, we will get much more sort of balance anyway. But yeah, I would guess that in terms of our open habitat, the coastal areas, the mosslands, the moorlands, these are our real expansive open habitats that are important. I suppose it's sort of interesting because people often talk about the panacea of species-rich grassland, which of course is vital in so many areas, particularly in the urban areas where we're not going to get any other habitat. But our open habitat expanses really are those in terms of what we have left naturally.
Well, there's just a couple of extra things, and then I think we'll wind up for the evening. Stuart has kindly offered that he might be able to put Neil's stuff on the Cumbria Biodiversity Data Centre website for people to see.
Yeah, I just get permission from Bee Wars.
Yeah.
Because I can, as I say, I'm happy to email this through remotely to anybody, but I think before it gets put anywhere, I'm sure Bee Wars, I can't see that have a problem. They may just have to ask somebody in Neil's family for permission. I'm not quite sure how this sort of thing works, but I think that will, yeah, to my mind, certainly, yeah, wherever it can be made accessible.
Well, that's one for Stuart to follow up, I think, but it's a good kind offer. And just very generally, some of the references that you gave us were quite in-depth and quite technical. What about a first step, a beginner's guide? Where could people start looking?
If you just want to look online, and you particularly on from a photograph point of view, you really can't beat Stephen Falk's site because that really does show everything. It's broken down into the families like the presentation was. So even though, you know, that's all in Latin and that's a bit hard going at first, we don't have that many bee families to be looking at. And then he very kindly sort of cross-references the common names which are used in the book. So that's going to be the easiest way in. And then for that more comprehensive backup, the Bee Wars site will give you the sort of the hard data if you want to pursue that more. But yeah, in terms of recommending literature, any of those references should be helpful. And yeah, if anybody's looking for anything specific, I'd be happy to, if I have it, pass it on or yeah, try and direct them to where they can get it.
Well, I think, Ben, everyone has said thank you so much for a really enjoyable talk and learning a lot about habitats and about vegetation that particular bees are attracted to. So there's been a lot of information that you've shared with us all tonight. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for giving up your early evening to spare some time with us.
Not at all.
And I've already started recording solitary bees since speaking to you. So thank you very much for sharing your enthusiasm and your passion for bees. And thank you everybody for attending this evening, and happy recording. Yeah,
thanks everybody for coming in. Apologies for the technical, well, you shouldn't be surprised if I don't even take photos, and surprised I've even got my face on the screen here. But yeah, thank you for coming, and thanks for your enthusiasm and Cumbrian recording.
Yeah. That's great. Lots of thank yous coming in the chat, Ben. So thanks ever so much for that.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Stuart. No, it's everyone. Thank you.